build some of our education products, and obviously help a lot of clients out there across the globe as they pick up these kind of products and get started with them.
So, short introduction, let's get to what all came here for. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the 3 guiding principles and the 3 essential practices of VFQ. Why we need to experiment, why experimentation is at the core of the discovery mindset, and why a discovery mindset matters, how to run experiments, and how to use experimentation to deliver value and to build better ways of working.
So if you caught the VFQ Foundations webinar just before Christmas, some of this will seem familiar. If you didn't, here's a nice reminder to go check that out. We'll send some links out later for that, as well as obviously the recording for this for folks who need it.
So the 3 guiding principles, value, flow, and quality. This sits at the core of what we do and how we see the world. So every company, every organization needs to deliver value, be it financial or not, needs to have a flow, a way of working flow, of work to flow through the system, and quality to the value that it delivers, and that is discovered through fast feedback.
So obviously we've got in here is that we're looking to really deliver value early and often. We're looking to optimize the flow of work end to end. So not just optimizing a single piece, but again, the true end to end of flow. And again, we're thinking about, as far as quality is concerned, we have to discover quality. The way to discover quality is through fast feedback. Okay, so again, as Pedro mentioned, these are kind of the 3 guiding principles. Often when we think of things around agility, we have to remember lots of things like, 12 this and 4 that. We're trying to distill this down to something that's far easier to kind of pick up and use and make it actually totally useful for folks.
So if you've been through the VFQ Foundations webinar, as Steve mentioned, these will be familiar. So will these, the 3 essential practices. Experimentation, value propositions, and visualization. During the past webinar, we asked people which of these should we actually go deeper on. So we're going to go deeper on experimentation today. It's probably the most important one if we're looking to develop a discovery mindset, which in today's world, given the amount of changes in context, it is key.
I guess it's the one that we kind of almost overlook simply because, the second essential practice, value propositions, obviously contains that wonderful word value. But it turns out we have to experiment our way to finding what's truly valuable. So realistically, we have to start with that, as Pedro says, the experimentation and discovery mindset. And you can almost guarantee you'll be seeing webinars around value propositions and visualization at some point in the future too.
True. So why do we need to experiment, right? This is experimentation, given how context is constantly changing, becomes really important to discover what it's truly valuable to the customer. We all hear people complain, companies complain that customers are changing really fast. The millennials, the next generations, we don't know what people want anymore. Experimentation is the way to best uncover what people really want, what are their jobs to be done. But it's also the way that we discover how we actually deliver that value, because ways of working can't be the same that they were previously. We all are suffering through the pains of having a lot of work and old structures supporting that work. So it ends up not working so well for most of us.
Yeah, so with the consumerization of IT, I guess one of the things that we all know, we can all feel this pain as the world is speeding up. We have to deliver faster. We can't just go, hey, this product will work. We actually have to discover if it's truly what our users really want, as Pedro kind of mentions. So we have to adopt newer ways and newer practices. But it turns out actually that some of these alleged newer ways are actually things that we do by default. At the very core of our humanness, we find out that experimentation is really part of our everyday life, even if we're not even totally aware that that's true.
Yeah, it is something that is embedded onto how we learn, both as children and as we grow up and become adults. We do learn through experimenting, to trying out things. If grabbing a stick and poking something, right? It see how it reacts. Putting your hand in something hot and see what kind of reaction you get. Is it too hot, too cold? These little things that we do regularly to learn about new things, we then get to work and forget about it, and forget that not all is known to us. So we're kind of trying to help people bring that curiosity and that discovery mindset back again.
Yeah, so inside the organization, we have this sense of we need to be more certain, but actually we can't be more certain. We have to be more discovery minded. We have to, again, probably as you got to work today, it turns out that you experimented and discovered slightly new and subtle ways of getting into work, whether it was avoiding a person, finding a new parking space, turning left when actually turns out that if you turn right, maybe that was traffic jam or something else. So we do this a lot in our everyday lives. What we have to do is fight that hesitation inside the workplace, where experimentation feels incredibly difficult because somebody out there wants to be certain. They want to know what you're going to deliver, they want to know when you're going to deliver it, and they want to know how much it's going to cost. So again, we know we can't dictate what these things are truly going to be, but we can discover our way to value and respond through that.
So how to experiment? I think a process always brings comfort to these things. Although we're showing it as a linear process, you can also see a lot of feedback loops, and probably there's even more than that, but we didn't want to overcomplicate the slide. But the key element is to start with an actual goal, right? To have an initial goal is key to be able to achieve something, because otherwise we just navigate without any route possible, right? Is just free sailing.
Yeah.
And then identifying what are the things that impact that goal. So for example, as Steve was saying, and to use a really simple example, if you want to park a car, the size of the car matters. The same thing at work. If we want to improve marketing, it's good to understand who are our customers, so that we can run experiments that are targeted to those customers. Then defining the knowns and unknowns, listing our assumptions and transforming those into hypotheses, so that we can actually build and run experiments that are deliberate, and that allows us to collect data, and that allows us to learn from it.
So so Pedro kind of alluded there to kind of about that stating a goal. So for instance, a good example of this is no one kind of decides, okay, I'm just going to go on a holiday without necessarily having, a destination in mind. So once you have a destination in mind, though, now all of a sudden there's a world of choices available to you. So there's factors that you can take into consideration. Do you want to get there, fast or slow? So if we decided to walk out of our office today and our destination turns out to be Paris, well, we can make a choice. We can go take the train. We can go get a plane. We can maybe even drive from here, or there's an X number of combinations depending on what we want to do. But within that, there's still a bunch of knowns and unknowns. So in other words, we don't necessarily know what traffic's going to be like. Are there ways in which we can find out? Turns out there are traffic websites. There's like apps called City Mapper and things like that. So we can find out some things. We may want to list some assumptions too. I'm assuming that the weather's going to be very similar to here in London, which pretty much equals grey and rainy. So with those assumptions, I can then do some other things, and eventually we get onto that to hypothesize. But as Pedro says, there are a lot of loops within this will actually take us backwards, which is great because we learn something, which means that then we can refine our goal to be the one that we're truly chasing down.
So again, starting with discovering what the problem is, right? We tend to start with potential solutions to perceived problems. And this usually comes to us in the form of an idea that someone had to suddenly get more traffic to the website, or a potential new solution.
Yeah, I think of the last time a customer came to you with what they believe to be a problem, but actually it turns out they gave you a solution. So in other words, instead of actually, I want a new way in which to, you know, track and deal with my customers, they actually turn around and say, hey, I want a CRM system, or I want SharePoint, or I want they basically give you a solution masquerading as a true problem. Okay, this is obviously in a sense that they're trying to help, you know, along the line, but it doesn't really get us to the heart of what problem are they trying to solve, because a CRM, for instance, could solve a lot of problems. But actually, if it's just a case of I want to know how many customers I've got, well, maybe there's a simpler and cheaper solution to that problem.
So to have that in mind allows us to be deliberate about digging deeper and realizing and trying to uncover the real problem, because sometimes, as we've just mentioned, it is not the first thing that comes up. The first thing that comes up is a solution. So to keep in mind, what are we trying to achieve, what the problem truly is, and sometimes we think that we got to a problem and there's a problem hiding underneath it. And asking why, it's really what helps us to unravel and to reveal this problem.
So we have to kind of get to a place, and if we look at children ask the best questions, and one of the best questions they ask is why. Why forces us to really examine what it is we're trying to do. If you say why, you know, if you ask them to get in the car and they say why, then you can say, well, because, you know, you could give an answer of because I said so, or you could say, well, actually, we need to go on a trip. Well, why? Because we need to do this. And eventually the why becomes because we're going to Disneyland, and then which, of course, they get in the car really quickly. So again, helping you get through those number of whys to the real thing that's trying to be achieved helps us actually get to that solution quicker.
And this seems like a really simple process and just a regular conversation, but it is also a tool that we can use and be deliberate about using it in the form of the five whys, which is used for many purposes, root cause analysis, or to dive deep into a goal statement, for example. Right? And when people come to us with, so my goal is to increase the revenue of the company, this is really tough goal to work with because there's many potential solutions. So we try to dig deeper in understanding what problem lies behind so that we can have a goal that is actionable. Right? And the five whys helps us reveal this.
Yeah, so the bigger and broader the statement, the more difficult it is to actually channel down into what are the things you need to do versus what is the big thing. So just increasing revenue, okay, what does that really mean? What are we really trying to do? Because there's lots of things we could do in order to do that, but what is the one thing you're really trying to drive for? So this kind of five whys, this kind of template that we typically use helps people get to that focusing element. So we write the initial goal statement, we ask through the five whys, each question leads us to a new piece of information, which leads to a new piece of information, which then helps us recraft the goal statement into as Pedro mentioned, into something that's actionable.
And it doesn't need to be more complex than this, right? The only thing that we need to do is to take it seriously and be deliberate about going through the process. And it is as simple as this for an initial goal statement and for our goal statement after going through the five whys, right? And what this enables us is to start thinking about the knowns and unknowns, which again is a really simple thing to do, right? Because where we need to discover things and where the problems might lie are on the things that we don't know, on the things that are hidden, on the how many users are using our app, or why are they not using it more, or what's our marketing target in terms of types of users. So all of these things are the problems to be solved, or are the things that will enable us to experiment and discover value. And these are also things that we can prioritize depending on how much impact they will have in us achieving the goal. So some of the unknowns are things that might be really crucial. We had a couple of examples on when running workshops where people say, well, we don't know who our user is, which is a big unknown to have, but not to surface it means that we'll be wasting time and money for a long, long time.
So if you look at the kind of issues that we might be faced with, so in other words, if somebody brings you a problem statement and you know it impacts one specific category of user or customer, how do you know whether this thing scales out to a bigger, wider audience? The fact is that we don't. Just because one person says, hey, this is a problem, or hey, I would like this new feature or facility, does not necessarily guarantee success. One of the things that we've kind of put on here, and just want to re-emphasize it, is that it's really hard to challenge your own knowns. Okay, so in other words, we need people to ask questions of how sure are we of this? You know, so you may say, well, the customer says it's a problem. Okay, but how do we know that it's a true problem and not just, you know, their reaction to something that they don't like the way it processes, or they'd maybe like to do it simpler, or maybe they find it a little bit clunky? But is that really a problem, or is that something else? Does it mean that we need to change something, or maybe it's help them understand the process that's around that? So making sure that we actually surface our knowns and unknowns helps us truly factor into where the problem is, what problems we should try and solve first. So again, as we kind of hint on here, is it helps us actually prioritize the pieces of work we should do first. And also you might sense from this is it also starts a process of, you know, breaking the problem down. Okay.
Yeah, and both the knowns, unknowns, and the 5 whys, as all of these processes, these are things to do, if possible, within your team, because it is the team effort and the engagement of all the team that allows us to surface things and that allows us to be honest with ourselves as well, and take things from our heads and put it into a paper and debate around it, because this process of having this conversation is something that helps us surface more and more things.
Yeah,
right.
This kind of gets a little bit hard, mainly because we believe that we know more than we truly do. So when we start, you know, we run this through workshops, when we actually start listing our knowns and unknowns, don't be surprised if your unknowns list starts to get very, very, very long. That's okay. That's perfectly okay. Because these are the things we have to go focus in on. So what we want to do is turn those unknowns into knowns. When we know those things, now we can do something with that. But whatever we don't, it's a risk that we should be aware of.
Yeah, and again, it's as simple as this, which is draw a line in the middle, knowns on one side, unknowns on the other, and then just pick the ones that are the riskiest.
Yeah, we'd love to give you a more complex template to really use, but it is that simple. And we use these in other aspects of life. Just think about, you know, the other types of lists that you write, which is like, oh, I don't know, a pros and a cons list. It's things, you know, for and against, knowns and unknowns. So it's what do you know, what don't you know? And then we can categorize that and prioritize through which maybe are our riskiest things. So what's the highest risk? What's the most impactful? What is least likely to be true? And then again, that list shapes itself so that we can take it further. So identifying, prioritizing our knowns and unknowns, and work through those unknowns till they become a known.
Yeah, and now that we've listed the initial goal, we've went through the 5 whys, and we've identified the unknowns, we've been through the core of the process, which is we've surfaced the things that we're gonna need to action, the things that we're gonna need to do something about, which will be the most riskiest or the prioritized unknowns, which makes us that much closer to success. So there are a couple of things that we can do, or that we should do once we surface the unknowns. If we are dealing with unknowns that we don't really know how to interpret, that we don't know enough about, so for me it would be rocket science, right? Because I'm not a scientist. The first thing I need to do is to go and learn a little bit more about it. Either research, talk to experts, understand more about the subject. if there are some things that we can experiment, that we know enough about, that we can understand the data, that we can analyze it once we run experiments, then that's the right time to go and do it. But also, if it's cheap enough or low risk enough, then we should just go do, right? Where experimentation shouldn't be an excuse to go slower when risk is really low and cost is super low. The only thing that we need to make sure of is that we are collecting the data and treating pretty much everything like an experiment, in the sense that we are collecting the data and collecting the learning from it.
So the caution around here is that again, the humanness in us makes us want to go to that realize sooner. So we have to make sure we explore the problem first. Once we know enough to then go experiment, we can create those experiments. But those experiments should lead us closer to, do we now know enough to put it into that realized category? Do we know enough? Is our knowledge level greater? Is our certainty greater? I mean, we can create experiments forever, but actually that's costly, that's expensive. We want to get to that point of, because the only way you will really know whether you've built the right thing is when it's in the hands of the customer. Okay, so we can explore and experiment internally forever, but actually if we don't get it into the hands of our customers, then we are missing the true answer to our problem. Is does somebody really want this? So explore, then experiment, but once you've done your experiments enough, that you need to put it into realize.
Yeah, and treat realize as the ultimate experiment.
Yeah.
Right? Which it is basically what it is when you release something into the market, or its final release, or that's, so the mindset of experimentation and learning should keep going as we just deploy a solution. So this is where we start talking about how do we actually build it, because we get to a point where we've uncovered the true goal, we've uncovered the unknowns, we know that we want to build experiments and not research, for example. So how do we build these experiments? And a couple of things about designing experiments that we're going to cover in the next slides. One is how to think about it. Talk about a little bit about variables and controls and why these matter and what to do about them. What about measures and why measures are important as well. Success criteria and looking into the results. So we usually use this simple card as well, which is we call the test and learn card. You've probably seen variants, or it's possible that you've seen variants of it, but it is just an hypothesis, a test. How will you measure, and what kind of metrics will you use, and what is the success criteria? And after you run the experiment, what have you learned from it, and what are you doing next? So this sits at the core of the doing experiments piece.
And it's a fairly straightforward tool to use, but it's also a great visualization tool to use. So it's also a great thing to understand where you are. How many test and learn cards have you got in flight? Again, are they prioritized? So again, if you're using any, visualization boards, Kanban boards or Scrum boards or anything like that, you could actually use these test and learn cards as that visualization as your work, flows through your system.
So how to think about experiments? I've talked about this a little bit, but basically our unknowns are full of assumptions. We have ideas about what they might be based on historical data, but they are still unknowns, they are still assumptions. So we need to transform those assumptions into hypotheses. So first of all, obviously list those assumptions. What are those? What are our beliefs? Yeah,
so things could be like, we assume it's valuable. We assume there is a market for this. We assume people will come and buy it. It's kind of the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. But what happens if they don't? Because that is a huge assumption. What happens if no one shows up? Okay, so how do you turn that into something, those assumptions, into a hypothesis to go test? Can you go test it out with a single person? Then can you test it out with a segment? Can you go then test it wider, et cetera, et cetera?
There's a really interesting company that has an app, I believe, called Carrot, and they have a weather app, and they have an activity exercise app. They have the same feeling, the same playfulness to it. I guess when they built the second one's like, would this work if we did it for something completely different?
Yeah.
Weather or doing 5-minute exercise. And these things need to be tested, right? These are assumptions that people enjoy these kinds of interactions, so they should work for other types of products as well.
It's an interesting one in the fact that we their kind of model is really interesting in the fact that when it gives you the details around the weather, it's somewhat sometimes semi-abusive.
Yeah.
It can be a little bit raw, but their assumption, their test was actually, if we be that same level of raw with somebody and try and use that as a motivation for them with their exercise, would that work? Turns out it was quite successful, but it wasn't an experiment. So it was a case of like, we see it works with weather, but would it work in another field? Kind of interesting to see where Carrot take it next.
So, and this leads us to talk about variables. So it is really important to ensure that we are clear about what we're testing. And it is really important that we have a control group, right? Especially in most of our cases, not the case for something purely exploratory like Carrot, but when we're introducing change into our workplace, for example, to understand the impact of a change, is important to understand if a control group suffered the same change or not, so that we can make sure that what we are changing is the actual thing that is impacting. And it is impacting the way we believe it would be impacting.
Yeah.
So that's the importance of the control group. And that's also why it's really important to make it simple. It's really important to make sure that we don't have more than 2 variables ideally per test. So because the more variables you have, the harder it is to actually track for all of them and to make sure that there is nothing else impacting our experiments.
Yeah, so if you were to run an experiment with variables such as we're going to drive more users to the website and they're going to like it, there's going to be higher interaction, and there'll be more sales from those. That's a lot of variables to try and understand what was the result of the test. Well, we got more sales, but actually, did we really get more users, or is it just we actually got a repeat? It's harder to narrow down on, did we truly get the outcome that we were searching for, if you kind of flood your test with a lot of information, a lot of variables, and too many controls.
And this is something that, to an extent, in IT is and other areas is fairly common to do A/B testing, right? It's just introducing one variable and changing one variable and comparing it to the control. So the mindset is fairly similar here. It needs to be sometimes that simple. Sometimes it's not possible, but whenever it is, it allows us to have better control over what's happening, and we have a better understanding of it. Because these are something that happens, right? I know that this is one that we have.
Yeah, you kind of have to be careful of the data that you're really looking at. So, for instance, this spurious correlation that we have here, it turns out the divorce rate in Maine declined as the consumption of margarine declined. They're not related, okay? They really aren't. But actually, looking at this data, could we assume that if we suddenly injected everybody in Maine with like another fake butter type substitute, would all of a sudden households start having more rows? Would they start getting more divorces? Yeah, the correlation, we just have to be careful of the data that we're looking at.
Yeah, obviously this is an extreme case, but sometimes things that we're looking at are not related, or the relationship is mediated by something else. So to simplify it is really important. So, and about measures, which is the next part of our test and learn card as well, it is really important to be deliberate about collecting data, be it quantitative or qualitative. And when I say qualitative data is also really valuable, but it's way more complicated to analyze properly. Quantitative data is probably the one that we work the most with, but for example, for user research, qualitative data is something that it is key to do and to use over quantitative when you're doing user interviews and those kinds of things. But the key is to build tests that we can actually measure and things that we can say 10 people said this specific thing.
If we can't measure anything, we can't tell if actually what we're doing is making a difference. So what we have to ensure that we do is make sure that the tests have a measure of success. In other words, if we think it's going to improve 25% of our user base, then we need to make sure we state that versus just it's going to improve our user base. So not being specific enough is an issue with this.
And ultimately, the success criteria, and to determine what strong evidence is for you, right? And what level of risk are you willing to live with? For example, in early stages of development of a new solution, in an app development solution, 30% of positive reviews might be something we consider a strong signal. If we are in the pharmaceutical industry, 30% of success rate in pharmaceuticals is not a good thing.
I suspect not. Yeah.
So we need to understand what success means in our case, and be really. It is an important thing. In early stages, again, 30% might be something really good. In later stages, 30% might not be enough to sustain a business model.
Yeah, it's basically getting to that point when you've hit that it's good enough. It's when you're done, when you've reached the point where, okay, we know enough about this that has produced in our context a successful result, and now we can go do something about that.
And analyzing results, most of the times, or many times, we are able to reach conclusions, but we also surface new things. And this is the interesting thing, is when we work with experiments, it feels like pulling a thread that sometimes almost never ends, and we need to be deliberate about it and know when to stop as well. Because they might not be risky, but we need to understand: have we reached the conclusion? Have we surfaced new information? Do we need to go all the way back?
Has it nullified your goal, for instance? In other words, you could come to a conclusion that the one person that has asked for that requirement actually is such a random case. They use your offering maybe once a year, once every few years, and it turns out when you push it out to market, when you try and test it out further, it turns out that no one else has this same use case. So therefore, your conclusion may be to not do anything, and that's incredibly valuable to find out sooner. So again, we want to experiment to find out and to discover if the idea, if the thing that you are trying to do is truly valuable in itself.
Yeah. So how do we start applying this, which is something that we want you to take? How can you get to work tomorrow and start applying some of these concepts? Give you a couple of potential hypotheses to take. And this is something that it's at the core of VFQ as well. So this is why we have these ones here. One is limiting WIP to one item per person will have a positive impact on productivity. And if you can quantify what positive means for you, in your case, what would be relevant to you, excellent. That would be what we propose. Or as alternatively, reducing the amount of work by 25% will have a null impact on the value that is delivered. These are two things that you can potentially try. We wanted to suggest things that you can start doing tomorrow. There's also experiments that you can run around delivering value, but those are ones that take a bit longer to develop and for you to think from the goal down.
There's a little bit more context required for those kind of ones. We do need to understand your context a little bit better. But again, there are things around is quite simple. Do we, you know, tomorrow you could take one of the things that you are working on today and literally list out, what do I know, what don't I know, okay? And build some hypotheses around how are you going to surface those unknowns and turn them into knowns. So in other words, what might the problem be? How might you then craft a hypothesis, and how might you then go and find that out? So in other words, the department is saying we want this particular thing over another thing. How are you going to find that out to be true? How are you going to create? Is it through a conversation? Is it through putting something into pilot? Is it, you know, there are a number of different ways to solve it. But actually you need to ensure that you're looking at the problem from, I'm going to say, the correct angle. So you understand that it's a true problem.
So final thoughts on this. Experimentation is a tool to go faster. It's a tool for learning. It's not a tool to create certainty. It is to help us remove the false certainty that we live in, and have us allow us to build a better understanding of our real context. Not all the unknowns are worth our time. Like some are just irrelevant. Don't waste time with those. Pick the ones that really matter. We only, and we've mentioned this during the webinar, we only truly know when we launch, right? It's not going to be until that happens.
Yeah, you can only know whether something is truly valuable once you give it to the person who actually benefits from that value. So in other words, your customer is your biggest guide in this. If your customer will use this, buy this, consume this, then you owe it to them to get it into their hands as soon as possible. So you need to, you know, experiment your way to successful. And how will you know it's successful? How will you know that, you know, you gave them or built the right thing for them? Okay, so without that experiment towards it, we often build something and it's kind of cross fingers and hope time. But this will help you get to that answer sooner.
Yeah, and lastly, as with any other skill, we only get good with practice. So the only way of starting having success with experimentation is just to start doing it. And to be honest, it might not work one time. Next time you'll know what to improve on, how the process might be better, and get better at it. It is not that complicated if we go one step at a time, and we can just go through this process that it is here. And by the way, we'll share the webinar, we'll share the slides as well.
So obviously, I mean, one of the things that always crops up within workshops is, so we have teams that go through the, you know, refining the goal through the 5 whys. And then they do it once. What they realize is when they get to the refined goal at the end of all those questions, they kind of want to do it again. My suggestion is do take your goal and ask another set of whys against it, because often it takes several swings at this to get to the true problem. So in other words, if you're going through a transformation and you've basically, you know, categorize it as the IT department needs to transform to better ways of working, and that's your goal, I wonder how many whys it will take you to realize that actually transforming the IT portion of an organization maybe isn't the real goal that you're after, and maybe transforming the entire organization is actually the one that you're after. But even then, I've still got a question as to, but why are you doing the transformation? What's at the heart of that? What are you hoping to achieve? Once you understand what you're hoping to achieve, then you can create those experiments. Then now we've got those true knowns and unknowns versus something incredibly vague and vast, which becomes incredibly difficult to say, okay, what do we do first and how can we set ourselves up for success?
And instead of a IT-wide or company-wide transformation, you start an experiment with how can we create a small group end-to-end that can go through a new process and see how it works, and slowly roll it out, or continue to test, experiment in different groups with different things, so that we have always a control and always a way of learning new things.
Yeah, I mean, if you put this in the same context as a baby learning how to, we assume that a baby learns to crawl before they can walk, and that's the kind of saying, you've got to learn to crawl before you can walk, or walk before you can run. But it turns out actually a baby has to learn, first of all, to roll off its back onto its stomach before it can even do that first crawl. So that even within that, there's a series of experimentations of rocking from side to side until eventually, you know, once the baby is like able to crawl, pretty much that's trouble from here on in. But that's the way we work. Humans do this. It's our natural state of discovery. Please remember that inside the building, inside the workplace, discovery and experimentation feels, I want to say, dangerous and hard to do, because we want certainty. We crave certainty. But the best advice we can give you is be okay with not knowing things, but make sure that you find out how to turn that into a known.
So what experiments can you run? Can you start running to discover value and to create better ways of working for your teams? It's the question that we will leave you with. Also, we have at valueforquality.com, you can get more information on this. You can sign in and go to our VIQ Foundations course, which is free, and get most of the templates and the thinking behind it, and go a little bit deeper into these things. And which we're open to questions for you.
So yeah, thank you. So we have a couple of questions coming in, so please feel free to keep those coming in. Well, one of which is how do I share with my management teams? So how do I share these kind of experiments and results with my management teams?
So I think management teams will appreciate that we are more deliberate about collecting data and making decisions based on data, right? And that's becoming more and more key for everyone and for companies. So as long as we present it clearly, as long as we present it with data sets that are reliable, I think that's one of the big selling points for this.
Yeah, I'd also add into that remember those test and learn cards. They are supremely useful for not only just capturing the data of what it is you're going to test, build the hypotheses, testing, and the results that come back, but actually they're incredibly useful to use when you are visualizing your flow of work. So to use them to stick them on the wall, so that actually you can share, you know, what it is you're trying to. You can share the, you know, the urgency of some of them versus other ones. So you can bring the management team kind of into this experimentation and discovery mindset, you know, because again, once you start to see these, how much uncertainty we deal with all the time, this becomes a much more natural way. So and I think, as again Pedro says, I think management appreciates the data that this kind of produces to allow us to go from being uncertain to certain. Okay.
Definitely. Another question that we have: what are the main advices to start experimenting? Good question. So the key thing, obviously, is to make sure that we are able to understand the data, the type of data that we're collecting, the area where we're experimenting on. Remember, not long ago in a workshop, a team had to involve finance and marketing into their app development process, and obviously none of them were experts in the two areas. So make sure that you bring along people that can help you. Make sure that you bring along people that have knowledge that will help you inform your decisions and inform your experiments and the analysis of the results of those experiments. Make sure it's a team effort. Make sure it's something that people get in, everyone that is required gets involved in, and not just your effort. I think that's key to start, because even for goals, even for unknowns, people from different areas will have different perspectives. The user will have different perspectives. Yeah. So make sure you involve people that can help you.
Also, in all honesty, just start experimenting, start capturing, making sure that you truly understand your goal. I was in a workshop earlier today where it was fascinating that a bunch of folks were going very far through a transformation, and they really didn't understand what the goal of the transformation was. But they were happy to turn up to workshops. Think about the times that you go to a meeting. Do you really know why you're there? Is the goal clear of why you are attending that meeting? What the purpose is that you're supposed to get out and contribute to that meeting? So we deal with this situation all the time. So again, make sure we're clear about the goals, and start. Do we all understand the goal? If not, work on that. Work through those 5 whys. What do you know? What don't you know? This is kind of one of the harder pieces, because in my head, we want to feel more certain. So therefore, actually putting our hand up and saying, yeah, I don't really know that, or being okay with saying it out loud. We don't know if our customers will buy this, but we know a way of finding out. Great, that is just gold. So in that case, make sure we go that. But again, start, try, experiment your way through experimenting. We have one coming in. Let me just expand my screen. It's just decided to close down a little bit. So how do we take the conversation from pre-tied in frameworks to make buyers understand a learning and discovery mindset? So people want to throw a solution immediately, making it expensive, compromising unknowingly. Yeah. So again, this is so we can throw things, we can throw agile at things, assuming that that's going to fix the problem. But again, if we don't really know what the problem is we're trying to solve, we do make those incredibly expensive decisions. I did have this with one client where one of the things that was once asked for, because they couldn't articulate the problem that we're trying to solve for, is to ask a development team to build them something like Facebook. When we probed into the question, when we actually asked why, and we have to, by the way, we have to do this in tandem with the customer or consumer, as close to that as we can possibly get. We can't do that in isolation. But once you start probing into why did you want Facebook, why, what is it you're really trying to do, you dig down deep enough, you find out that all they wanted to do was have a document repository system where they could tell which documents were liked. And that was the key for them. They tried to explain something based on a Facebook like, based on that. So we would have been an incredibly expensive situation had the team continued to build that. But actually getting them back in the room, taking it slowly, and not just accepting requirements, as is, as a whole, allows us to actually have that conversation. But again, you have to build that bridge back again of, when we look at the world as it is, there is a certain amount of distrust. But if we start asking questions, if we start getting into the conversation about how might we do this together as a joined up exercise, we'll definitely get to a much better solution.
And definitely set yourself up for success, right? Like there are people and there are types of customers that won't be able to shift that quickly, but there's always someone that likes to work in this different way. There's always someone that wants to experiment. And if you build a test case with these people that are willing to help you and are willing to start changing, usually what follows is more people want to start working like this because they see the results are better, and they see the things get faster, and relationships are better, and the environment is better. If things flow better, everyone else will jump on board. So make sure that you start by working with people that will be able to follow you in your journey and that want to follow you in your journey as well, if possible.
Awesome. So guys, thank you so much for the questions. I'm just checking, see if we have any more before we kind of wrap this up for today. So we've got one, which is, how can I use the results to help reframe new questions?
Yeah, I think that ties to what we were referring earlier. Usually, well, sometimes the types of results that we have lead us to have different questions, right? So, for example, if we have a new marketing engine, or we put in a new marketing engine, or we put in a new software that allows us to collect other types of data, be whatever type of software it is, that will unravel new types of data that we can suddenly work with, right? So let's be deliberate about collecting the data from those experiments, collecting those results, and reframe it so that, and make sure that you use that data not just to make decisions, but to progress and continue to evolve your solutions, your options, your...
Yeah, so if you have metrics around, how many users actually liked or disliked something, so you can use that data to say, okay, 10% of folks liked, what we put in front of them, that everyone else not so much. You can then ask better questions of, okay, what is it about this that didn't meet your needs? Are we truly answering, are we truly giving you an answer to your problems, or are we just injecting a solution that actually doesn't appear to solve the problem that you're really after? So it might be that the data takes us back to the goal that we're trying to solve, and maybe it was the wrong one. So a lot of the times the data takes us to a nicer, well, a better question, okay, which again drives to, did this data change the goal? Does this question lead you to a new goal and therefore a new outcome?
Well, yeah, a better question: does it open a new world of unknowns and a new world of experiments, where we focused on the wrong thing all along?
And remember,
sometimes it happens.
No one likes the kind of term fail fast because it includes the term fail, which we don't want to do. But what we do want to do is learn. Okay, we want to learn what works and what doesn't. So this is a very safe, low impact way of finding out what truly works. It's very inexpensive because, again, we often rush to that solution. So the question earlier was about, we rush to a solution immediately because we want to be helpful, we want to be useful, we don't want to be slow and everything else. So therefore, rushing to the first solution that we see often seems like a good thing to do. But what happens if it's not solving the problem?
Means that we have to go through a lot of solutions before we actually fix it. And if we're not deliberate about it, we might be on it for years and years. Right?
Yep, that's very true. Okay, so guys, thank you so much for your time today. It's always appreciated. There is a survey. If you could please take a few minutes to fill it in, that would be always appreciated. So your input, your feedback is supremely wonderful. So thank you so much for that. We'll be sharing the recording out there. And do we have anything else? Do you want to do a quick plug for Foundations?
Yeah. So go to www.valueflowquality.com if you haven't yet. Just sign in. You have access to the free course, Foundations course, that covers the 3 essential practices and the 3 guiding principles. And reach out, any question, anything, feel free to just reach out and we're available.
So if you want to experiment with the experimentation techniques, so go to the VFQ Foundations online course, as Pedro says, it's free. Take a look at it. Again, your feedback, again, truly welcome. But that's it for this evening from us in London. So
we'll be covering value propositions and visualization soon. We'll keep you posted. So thank you so much, and speak to you next time.
Thanks, guys.